He shall floor. I have spent 20 years on the buying side of this business. Trade show floors, order sheets, sample tables stacked 3 high with coolers that all swear they are nothing alike. And the first thing you learn when you are the one signing the purchase order is this: a cooler does not become a brand until the very last step, when somebody glues a badge to the front. Walk one aisle of any big outdoor retailer and count the coolers. You will get to 7 different names without trying. 7 logos, 7 price tags, 7 stories about ruggedness and independence. Now flip them over. Read the mold seams, the foot pads, the latch posts. Do that for a living, and the illusion falls apart, because those 7 rivals keep tracing back to the same short list of molding floors. One sells for around $60. One sells for north of $200. Same factory. Different costume. Here's what nobody in that booth is going to volunteer. The big number printed on the box, the one that is supposed to let you compare them, 5 days of ice, 10 days of ice, has no industry standard behind it at all. It is a decoy. And while several of those badges are quietly wearing the same shell, there is one brand that owns its own American factory and refuses to play the rebadge game entirely. So today I am taking you behind the order sheet. Who actually builds these boxes? The one metric that fools buyers every single trip. The 2 specs that separate a real performer from a decorated markup. And the one cooler that will keep your catch cold without robbing you blind. The fish on the end of your line do not care what sticker is on the side of your box. By the time we are done, neither will you. He, same floor, different stickers. Before you can see the trick, you have to understand how the box gets made, because that is where the markup hides. Picture making a hollow chocolate egg. You pour the liquid in, then slowly turn the mold in every direction so it coats the inside evenly and hardens into one seamless shell with nothing in the middle. That is rotational molding. Just swap the chocolate for powdered polyethylene plastic and add an oven. The powder melts, the mold turns on 2 axes, and the plastic creeps up every wall until you have a single double-walled shell, no glued seams, no weak joints. That is why you can throw one out of a moving truck and it shrugs it off. Now here is the part the marketing never mentions. Most of the names on those boxes do not own a single oven. They run what we call a private label, or OEM, strategy, and as a buyer, I have literally done it. You open a contract molder's catalog the same way you would flip through a parts book. You point at a generic shell, a 45 quart, a 75 quart. You pick a color. You hit their minimum order. You send them your badge art. A few weeks later, your exclusive cooler shows up on a pallet. $0 spent on tooling. $0 on engineering. The mold was never yours. Take a company most American anglers have never heard of, the Coor Group, out of Ningbo, China. They are not a brand you shop for. They are a factory, and a massive one, pushing out something like 400,000 coolers a year and shipping the bulk of them straight into North America and Europe, openly offering OEM service to anybody with a logo and a budget. That single floor can wear a dozen different American badges before the year is out. So when 2 coolers on the shelf look suspiciously like twins under the hood, that is not a coincidence. That is the catalog doing its job. But the cleanest proof I can give you is not hiding overseas in a factory you can never visit. It is sitting on a shelf in Minnesota, and the company behind it will tell you the secret to your face. He beige EADAADMETSA twin. There are 2 coolers I want you to look up after this. One is called Maluna. The other is a Duce. Premium, heavy duty, both built in Baxter, Minnesota. And on Duce's own website, in plain English, they say it. The Maluna and the Duce are made in the same factory, by the same family-owned business, and the only difference between them is the badge on the front. Sit with that. This is not me reading mold numbers and guessing. This is the manufacturer telling you, on the record, that 2 different coolers are the same cooler wearing 2 name tags. Same tapered insulation walls, same non-slip feet, same stainless bottle opener built into the body. 2 badges, 2 price conversations, 1 box. When the company that makes it is comfortable admitting that out loud, You should assume the brands that stay quiet are doing the exact same thing and just hoping you never flip the lid. Now turn it the other direction, to the most famous name in the aisle. Yeti does not own a molding line either. The shell, the part that actually keeps your ice alive, gets molded by contractors. One of them is not a secret at all. Dutchland Plastics in Oostburg, Wisconsin, one of the largest contract rotomolders in the country. They have been molding Yeti coolers since 2013, and we know that because Yeti itself handed Dutchland a supplier award and put it in a press release. The cult brand's flagship shell comes off a Wisconsin contract floor that also molds kayaks and office chairs. And here is the twist on the twist. Even Dutchland is not some plucky independent anymore. It got bought up by a larger holding company. The badge says rugged individual. The cap table says portfolio asset. So if the box on the premium shelf and the box on the budget shelf can roll off the same kind of floor, what exactly is that extra $200 buying you? That is the badge tax, and it is time to do the math on it. VHE Badge G tax. Yeti pioneered the idea that a cooler could be a status symbol and credit where it is due. That was brilliant marketing. But let us be precise about what you are buying. Yeti is a design and marketing powerhouse that does not own a single factory. They engineer in Austin, Texas, and then the physical product gets molded and assembled wherever the contract lands. And it lands in more places than the lifestyle ads suggest. By Yeti's own account, the Tundra hard coolers are made in the United States, in Iowa and Wisconsin, and also in the Philippines, and you, the buyer, have no easy way of knowing which one you are holding. Their Rambler drinkware and Hopper soft coolers come out of China. That is not a leak or a rumor. Yeti publishes its own supplier list, and on it you will find names like Zhejiang Hairs, a Chinese vacuum bottle factory making Yeti drinkware. Lately, the tariff math has gotten loud enough that Yeti told investors it was racing to move 80% of its drinkware out of China by the end of 2025, spreading production into Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and beyond. A premium American brand sprinting between overseas floors to dodge a tariff is not the picture on the box. You have probably heard the Yeti versus RTIC story thrown around as proof that all coolers are clones. RTIC built its whole pitch on undercutting Yeti by sourcing from overseas factories directly, and Yeti sued over the look of the thing. RTIC had to redesign. But here is the lesson buyers actually take from that fight. Copying a silhouette is not the same as matching a build. Two boxes from the same plant can still have different foam, different gaskets, different quality checks. Similarity is a clue. It is not a verdict. So when you drop $400 on a flagship cooler, understand the line items. You are paying for a beautiful finish, a famous logo, and the feeling of belonging to a club. The foam inside is genuinely good. It is just not exclusive, and it is not what is setting that price. The badge tax is real, and it buys a story, not a single extra hour of cold. Which brings us to the only thing that does buy you cold. The two specs the booth will never volunteer. THE TWO specs, THE Booch, want volunteer. Forget the logo. Forget the marketing. A cooler is just a winter coat for your ice, and like a coat, two things decide whether it actually keeps the cold in: how thick the insulation is, and how well it seals at the openings. Everything else is decoration. Start with the wall, because that is the real starting line. Reach into the lid of a good cooler, and you are feeling closed-cell polyurethane foam, the same dense stuff sprayed into the walls of a freezer. The premium boxes inject 2 to 3 inches of it under pressure so it fills every cavity, leaving no air gaps for heat to sneak through. In insulation terms, that foam gives you roughly an R value of 6 to 7 per inch, and R value just means resistance to heat moving through it. Higher is better. Now pick up a cheap cooler, the kind under $150. A lot of those cut the cost with expanded polystyrene, basically dense picnic cooler foam, and its R value drops to about 4 per inch. Same shape on the outside, thinner defense on the inside. That gap is the whole ball game. The second spec kills more ice than anything else, and it lives at the edge. The thickest walls in the world mean nothing if the lid does not seal, the same way the best freezer is useless with a screen door on it. What you want is a continuous rubber gasket running the entire rim, not just dabbed in the corners, squeezed tight by latches that actually clamp the lid down. If the latches feel loose or the lid rocks, cold air bleeds out and your ice is gone faster than the sticker ever promised. Here is a buyer's trick you can run right at the boat ramp before you ever load it. Press down hard on the closed lid and feel for play. Then run a finger around the gasket looking for gaps. That 10-second check tells you more than any number on the box. Speaking of that number, when a box brags 10 days of ice, laugh, because there is no industry standard behind that claim and every brand writes its own test. They pre-chill the cooler, pack it dead full of solid block ice, lock it in a climate-controlled room at a mild 70 degrees, and never open the lid. That is not your July. When Field and Stream actually ran 7 of these coolers through 8 days of real summer heat, shuffling them in and out of the sun, the truth came out. Most held ice for 4 to 6 days, and the honest expectation on the water, where you are flipping the lid 20 times a day for a cold drink and dropping warm fillets on top, is 4 to 6 days, period. There is a newer answer to all this, too. A Norwegian outfit called Oyster built the Tempo with no foam at all, just double aluminum walls with a vacuum sealed between them, like a giant thermos bottle, which was a genuine engineering feat because a vacuum panel wants to collapse in a square shape. It holds cold like nothing else its size, and it will cost you around $500 to find that out. So now you can read a cooler with your hands instead of your eyes. But there is one more lesson in this aisle, and it is the hardest one, because it is about a brand a lot of us loved and trusted. The warranty that DI'd. For years, if you wanted to skip the Yeti badge tax but still wanted an elite, genuinely American-made cooler with a lifetime warranty behind it, the answer was ORCA. The Outdoor Recreation Company of America started in Nashville, Tennessee, back in 2012, built honestly great rotomolded gear, and stood behind it with a warranty that promised to outlive you. As a buyer, ORCA was an easy one to stock. The story was clean. Then the story changed, the way these stories usually do. In January of 2020, ORCA was bought by a private equity-backed group, McNeil Pride Group, which later rebranded itself as Gather Outdoors. For a while, the pandemic boom carried everybody. But when the craze cooled, the math caught up. And on January 24th, 2025, Gather sent an email to its dealers announcing that ORCA was done. Production stopped. Marketing stopped. The brand shut down. Here's the part that should change how you shop forever. That legendary lifetime warranty effectively died with the company. Gather said it would honor parts replacements for 1 single year after the closure, and that it would not accept returns. So every angler who paid a premium specifically for lifetime coverage learned the hard way what that word is worth when the company behind it is gone. A warranty is not a promise carved in stone. It is only as alive as the business standing behind it, and a private equity owner can switch that business off with one email. That is exactly why I built a 1-page field guide for this episode, a boat-side audit you can laminate and keep in the truck, the 2 specs to check, the lid test, and the brand stability questions to ask before you spend a dime. Grab the free Forbidden Lures Cooler blueprint at the link in the description, and you will never get talked into a decorated markup again. Because once you accept that the badge can vanish, the only smart question left is which boxes actually respect your money. The Kohlers that want ROBU, you. Want you. So let us spend your money like a buyer, not a tourist. If you refuse to pay for a logo, here are the boxes that actually earn their price tag. Start with the one that will not rob you, and it is the answer to that dead warranty problem, Bison. With ORCA gone, Bison is the last big independent, family-owned American cooler maker standing. It runs out of Fort Worth, Texas, where it has been family-owned since 2011, started by a former Southwest Airlines guy named Jeremy Denson, and the coolers are American-made, designed in Texas, molded in Colorado, finished back in Texas. No gimmicks, just thick walls, serious latches, and a lifetime warranty backed by a company that is still answering the phone. In that same Field and Stream torture test, while every other cooler had melted down to water by day 6 or 7, the Bison was still sitting on a pile of ice on day 8. That is the headliner. If you fish and you cook your catch, look hard at the Canyon Pro 45, a regional brand out of Arizona that earns its reputation. It runs slightly thicker insulation and a thicker gasket than the big names, and in that same test it held ice a full 6 days. The genius part for an angler: the included divider snaps into the lid and turns into a food-safe table, so you have a clean surface to fillet and season right on top of the box. Need to roll your gear down a dock instead of carrying it? The RTIC 52 Ultralight is built for that. Rotomolded coolers are notoriously heavy, but RTIC engineered this one down to about 30 pounds empty while still holding 78 cans on rugged all-terrain wheels with an aluminum pull handle. Be honest with yourself about what it is, though. In head-to-head testing, it won best overall for mobility and value, but its ice retention landed mid-pack, around 4 real-world days, not class-leading. You are buying easy transport, not the longest cold. For straight no-frills value, the Engel 50 runs around $270 and quietly held ice into days 5 and 6 in the same test, simple and rugged with nothing to break. 2 budget notes. The Igloo Trailmate is not a premium killer, despite what some folks claim, but for around $100 it gives you giant all-terrain wheels and a real 4 to 5 days in the field, which is incredible value for the price, even if the luxury box is still outlasted. And the Ozark Trail at Walmart is the OEM secret hiding in plain sight. A real rotomolded cooler for cheap. The same kind of import shell we talked about up top, just without anybody charging you for the story. None of these will impress the guy at the boat ramp with a logo. All of them will keep your fish cold. But even the best box on this list will fail you if you pack it like a trash can. Pack IT, AT like a buyer, not a tourist. A $400 box is useless if you treat it like a trash can, so here is how to get your money's worth out of any cooler. Rule 1. Pre-chill it. The night before a trip, throw a sacrificial bag of gas station ice inside and let the plastic walls themselves get cold. If you load fresh ice into a cooler that has been baking in a 120-degree garage, a third of that ice dies instantly, just cooling down the walls before it ever touches your drinks. Rule 2. Respect the ratio. 2 parts ice to 1 part food and drinks, with the ice packed above and around whatever you want coldest. Skimp on the ice and you have just bought an expensive warm box. Rule 3, and this one is counterintuitive, so ignore the guy who tells you otherwise. Do not drain the cold water. As long as your food is not going soggy, that ice-cold meltwater is actually insulating the solid ice still floating in it. Drain it and you have swapped cold water for warm air, which makes everything melt faster. Leave it until you genuinely need to pour it off. And manage your lid time like it costs you money, because it does. Every time you open it on a hot deck, you dump the cold and pull in heat, so grab what you need and clamp those latches back down. One more for the long haul. When the trip is over, dry the gasket and store the box with the lid cracked open so the seal does not compress or sour. If that gasket ever hardens or splits, replace it. Most real brands sell you a new one for a few dollars, which is the whole point of buying from a company that is still around. The He Bo Tom line. So here is where 2 decades on the buying side leaves me. This whole industry is built on selling you a lifestyle, on convincing you a logo makes you a better outdoorsman. But the base holding tight to that brush pile does not care what sticker is on the side of your box. It only cares what is on the end of your line. Stop paying the badge tax. Understand the floor your cooler actually rolled off of. Know that the $150 box and the $400 box are usually cousins from the same kind of molding line, and that the only honest way to compare them is foam, thickness, and seal, never the name on the latch. Buy on the build, back a company that is still standing behind its warranty, and put the difference where it belongs. Better lures, more gas in the boat, more hours on the water. If this pulled loose something the industry would rather you did not see, do me one favor. Subscribe, drop a like so it reaches the next angler, and tell me in the comments what cooler you are running right now and whether it has ever let you down on a trip. I read them. Until next time, keep your lines tight and your ice colder than the markup. This is Forbidden Lures.